on today's Story Beat.
For me, defines a great artist is their ability to create this connection with the people who are listening to them, whether in a live context or in a recorded setting. It's almost like a spiritual thing, I think. It's like it's a message that they send out and that a listener receives and internalizes in their own way, and that listener has a response to. It's some sort of deep connection that just makes you go, whoa, and you don't really know why you're going, oh, it's not, whoa, what a great lyric. It might be that, but usually it's this extra little special something that they've created and sent out.
When does the experience begin? Is it when you hear about the concert? Is it when you buy the ticket? When does it end? With the memory still there? It never ends. So, that experience is not just the performance, I would argue. It comes from in the 70s, queuing outside Newcastle City Hall for 28 hours to get tickets to see the Stones, queuing for a day to get tickets to see Bob Dylan and Earl's Court in 1978. And that was all part of the experience. Of course, you don't do that now. You sit on Ticketmaster at 9 a.m. and try and get in quick to get the tickets.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guests today are Peter Smith and Laura Smith. Peter is an Emeritus Professor at the University of Sunderland in the United Kingdom. Though paralyzed from the neck down, Peter continues teaching students online while researching and writing about a number of subjects. He recently published articles and books on topics related to disability, postgraduate education, and rock music. He supports a number of students who are completing their master's dissertations and PhD theses. Peter is perhaps best known for his great contributions to artificial intelligence. Peter's daughter, Laura, also publishes, sometimes with Peter, on topics related to disability, rock music, and the UK radio show The Archers, of which she's a passionate follower and listener. Laura, who lost her sight at a young age, is a mother of 2 children and lives in the northeast of the UK. She's a qualified social worker, teacher, and classically trained singing teacher. Peter and Laura recently published My Travels Through the Maelstrom of Punk Rock. As a young man, Peter's rebellious nature pulled him away from his academic studies into the world of punk rock. During the late 1970s, he threw himself into a life of attending turbulent, manic, and perilous concerts full of young, disillusioned punks and skinheads, many of whom saw Peter as an outsider. He witnessed firsthand early performances by numerous groups like the Sex Pistols, The Clash, The Cure, and dozens more. Amidst the sea of punks, Peter's long hair stood out, attracting trouble and tempting danger. Life was daring, wired, and scary, yet fun. I've read My Travels Through the Maelstrom of Punk Rock and can tell you it's a fantastic exploration of both Peter's youth as a music superfan and also an eye-opening probe into the history of how punk rock developed in England in the 1970s, 80s, and beyond, including dozens of accounts of Peter attending concerts of now infamous bands before they became widely known. So for all those reasons and many more, it's my distinct privilege to welcome the authors and teachers, Professor Peter Smith and Laura Smith, to StoryBeat today. Peter and Laura, welcome to the show.
Hi, Steve. It's a pleasure to be joining you today.
It is a great privilege for me to have you on the show, believe that for sure. So let's go back in time a little bit. For Peter in particular, was punk rock among your earliest inspirations and influences musically, or did something precede that?
I think that my first memory of music was the Beatles and She Loves You. It's something, it came from another world, something switched in my head, and I loved pop music from then on. I would say there was 2 other things that really influenced me while I was a kid. I never saw the Beatles, I was too young, that's one regret. And that was the Beatles again, Strawberry Fields, I think another song that came from another planet. and Bob Dylan and Like a Rolling Stone, I would say they all influenced me. But then I went to my first gig when I was 12 by myself to see the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band, supported by Yes and Roy Harper, and that got me into rock performance. And from then on, I was absolutely obsessed with going to see rock bands. And I carried on seeing the Stones in 1971, the Who the same year. And I had a broad taste before punk. I went to see bands like T-Rex with Mark Bolan, Mott the Hoople, Roxy Music in their early days, alongside Led Zeppelin in their early days, the Rolling Stones, the Who, Pink Floyd, and Deep Purple.
You saw virtually the entire history of rock and roll music, basically.
Well, I tried to. I'm obsessive, and it was like almost collecting. I had to collect concerts. So if I hadn't seen a band, I had to go and see them. And if they didn't play locally, I would drive a couple of 100 miles to see them and drive a couple of 100 miles back in the night to see the band.
So, Laura, were you introduced to music, I assume, by your father, yes?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think my first ever memory is a Beatles song. I think I've got a very clear memory of sitting, maybe even in a high chair, but certainly very young, sitting at a table of some sort. And If I Fell, which I think is off Hard Day's Night album, being played, and just thinking I loved it, just in my childish way, just really connecting with it. And there was always music on in the house. You know, before I ever saw any music live, there was just music on in the house all the time. The records were always on. You know, lots of really broad range of sounds, really. I remember charging up and down the living room with my brother David to, I think it was Mother's Little Helper by the Stones, and kind of bouncing on the sofa to that, and just all sorts of music that really reminds me of my childhood to this day. You know, I
was going to say, you think you had a very eclectic musical upbringing.
Yeah, definitely, completely. It was, you just never knew what was going to come out of that record player from day to day. It could be something sometimes a bit scary. When I was little, there was like quite, you know, more punk or shouty music, as I would call it, would sometimes be on, or very beautiful kind of folky stuff, or more melodic stuff. It was a real massive collection of music that I was introduced to really young.
I'm going to guess you probably were listening to music in the womb.
Oh, I would imagine so. I don't see how I couldn't be.
Exactly. So you're both prolific writers. What drew you to being writers? Why do you write? So I'll ask Peter first.
I think I was actually going back to childhood. I was good at writing stories at school in English, and they always encouraged me. So I wrote a lot of stories at school. But then becoming an academic, you had to write, you know, you had to do research and publish papers to get promotion, and you just did it. So it was natural to me to write. So I've written 300 odd academic articles over the years.
That's amazing.
And spoken at conferences around the world about academic stuff. And I've written academic books as well as rock books. So I've always written, and in both an academic style and in a more popular style. Popular music, writing about popular music, was a bit of a stretch for me at the start, but I've kept up a blog of every concert I ever went to. I started it, I don't know, 10 or more years ago, just writing about a concert when I went. And then my late wife, Marie, Laura's mom, said, why don't you go back and do them all? So I tried to remember every concert I've been to. I always kept a program and a ticket, and I photographed them, put them on the blog. And every morning I got up early and spent an hour writing an entry. And I did that for 5 years to go back and put them all in. So There's a couple of thousand entries in there, from Led Zeppelin through to the Sex Pistols, the Clash, the Damned, through to Pink Floyd, through to Barbra Streisand. Sorry, Laura?
The Spice Girls. He misses that out.
Spice Girls, David Bowie on Ziggy Stardust tour, loads of bands.
So all the way from the Sex Pistols and the Cure to the Spice Girls.
And Barbara Streisand.
And Barbara Streisand. Well, that's what you call range. That's a lot of range.
And Bob Marley.
And Bob Marley. Sure. And I bet you listen to classical as well.
And that not a lot, to be
No?
honest. As a kid, my mum and dad would play classical, but no. But the nearest we got is only last year I went to see an Ennio Morricone concert. Of course, the great Maestro had passed, but his son was conducting his orchestra, and they were playing all the stuff from the Clint Eastwood music, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly,
Right.
which I love, and
Right.
that was a great concert. So that's the nearest I've gone to classical, apart from if you would class Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells as classical as well.
So Laura, what makes you a writer? Why do you write?
I think, again, looking back to childhood, another great gift that particularly my dad gave me was a love of stories. And every single night, without fail, he would read a story to me before I went to sleep. And if he went away for work, he would owe me the amount of stories he'd missed. So if he went to Hong Kong and was away for, maybe up to a week or something, he would come back and have to read me 7 or 8 stories, because that was the deal. And he would make up stories too. And I have great memories of him and also his dad, my granddad, just reading to me a lot. Also, I think with losing my sight at a young age, audiobooks were very important and to me as a child, and I used to listen to those an awful lot. So a love of story was the beginning of it, I guess.
Do you think of yourself as a storyteller?
I guess in a very non-professional sense, I love telling stories to my children. And I think a go-to way of kind of communicating to them different ideas or maybe tricky things that they're having to go through in their life, I'll tell them a story about it. I'll make up a character, or I'll use storytelling to help with those situations. So it is a go-to thing, I guess, in my life to kind of express certain things.
Well, you've got a book out. The two of you have a book out, and so that makes you a professional.
That's true. Yeah, I guess the way I look at a lot of my professional writing has been very much in collaboration with my dad for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And I've learned a lot from him, and a lot of my job as co-writing with him is expressing his stories and bringing those stories to other people.
Right. So let's talk about your depth of knowledge about punk rock, and Peter in particular, because obviously you went way back in the day. Why punk rock? How did you transition from starting out loving pop and winding up at punk? How did that happen?
Well, I just loved all music, and I read the music papers about this new band from London called Sex Pistols, and they were playing at a pub in Whitby, which is about 60 miles away. And my wife and I drove in through the rain on a really rainy night to see this band called Sex Pistols, who were playing in a pub on a disco night, and everyone there was expecting the disco and expecting, I think, ABBA and Dancing Queen were number one. That's another band I saw, ABBA. Anyway,
ABBA.
They were really good. So the disco went off, and the Pistols came on, and it was like something from another planet. Johnny Rotten, dressed in the bondage gear with a little tam on, singing Anarch in the UK, which was their new song at the time. They hadn't released it, but it was a new song, and singing stuff from the new album. But also covers of The Who's Substitute and the Monkees' I'm Not Your Stepping Stone. And I just thought they were amazing. But unfortunately, the crowd around me didn't. They didn't know what to think of it. They were putting their hands on their ears, and they were moving back and frightened of John, who was hanging over the mic and sneering at them and snarling at them. And after, 20 minutes, half an hour, the DJ said, "Well, thank you, Sex Pistols. Now we'll go back to the disco." And he switched the sound off, and they had to get off stage. And the disco went back on. But from that night on, I went to see as much punk as I could, because I found it exciting and different and exhilarating. And I liked the danger of being the only one in with long hair and everybody's skinning it or a punk, and it being in fear of my life to some extent.
So you like the adrenaline rush of going into this dangerous situation?
Yeah, it was great. It was magic, and but at the same time, I was going to see Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles one night. I remember seeing Fleetwood Mac on the Rumours tour and the Eagles on the Hotel California tour. And that was the same time as I was going to see punk bands, you know. So I was going to see both. I didn't switch from being someone with long hair and to being a punk. I kept my long hair, but I did start wearing Denson Winklepicker boots, Chelsea boots.
You'll have to explain to the listeners what those are.
They're what the Beatles used to wear. You might call them Beatle boots, but they're made by a company called Denson in the UK in the 60s, and they just pull on black boots with really, really pointy toes and Cuban heels, and so a bit of a high heel, bit of a wedge heel.
Would you wear those to the punk concerts as well?
Yeah. Instead of flares, I started wearing drainpipe Levi jeans, Lewis leather jacket, which is sort of biker jacket, sort of thing the Ramones would wear. So I had a black biker jacket on, a punk t-shirt, a pair of drainpipe trousers, and Winklepicker shoes. So I sort of looked the part partly, but I still had long hair as well.
And the long hair threw the punks and skinheads off, yes?
I think they just thought, you know, I was either cool or I was really hard, which I wasn't, you know, to dare come to this. So they just left me alone. Or they came and taught me and said, "Hey, what you doing here?" And I'd just say, "I love the music," you know, and tell them what I've seen, and they'd be really impressed, and that was fine. So we kept at the back while the glasses were flying and when everybody was spitting.
Spitting and glasses flying. That always sounds like a good time to me.
Yeah, it's not if you get the spit all over you.
Goodness. So, Laura, have you been to punk concerts?
Well, you know, I was born in 1988, so
Right.
sadly I miss, you know, the absolute wonderful times that Dad talks about.
Sure.
However, what I have done is I've been with Dad to revisit these artists when they've, you know, bands have reformed or people have toured again. And I guess, what would you say, Dad? Who have I seen that's punk? I guess Patti Smith.
Patti Smith, Buzzcocks.
Yeah. Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, Magazine. Yeah. So I've found these bands and artists that I've loved, but at a later time in their performance history.
You came to know them more off of recordings than off of live performances.
For sure, yeah. And I guess I went to see them as more of like a historical, wow, I can't believe I'm going to see these guys. You know, I've heard all these stories from my dad and I've listened to the music, and it's more been a real exciting experience to see what have now become legends, whereas Dad saw them first time around, you know. So
Peter, I know you also became enamored at some point with goth. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I like goth in the form of The Mission and All About Eve, and it depends what you call goth. The Damned, I suppose, were a goth band of sorts. Susie and the Banshees were maybe to some extent, but yeah, I got maybe The Cure you might call goth. I don't know. It depends what you call goth. But yeah, I got into that, not to the great extent that I was wearing goth clothes.
I'm curious, between goth and punk, but punk mainly, how did that have any kind of an impact on your, I'm guessing, more sedate academic career? Did it alter the way people looked at you? Did they know that this was your thing?
People at work did, and they sort of thought I was crazy when I told them about it, about who I was going to see. And a lot of people who were still in the classic rock would say, "What are you going to see them for? You know, they're rubbish." But I just enjoyed the energy, the ramshackleness of it, the danger of it, and the authenticity of it. Patti Smith, Laura mentioned, I've loved Patti Smith since I first saw her in the late 70s. And I think she is, you know, Patti, what you see is what you get. She is very authentic. She is herself. And I like crazy people like Iggy Pop, who I saw several times, throwing himself around on the stage, jumping in the crowd and getting the crowd up on the stage. There's another one I took Laura to see, Iggy Pop, yeah.
Yeah.
So what attracts you to this energy, this manic on stage throwing yourself around. What attracts you to that?
I don't know. That's the word you said. It's the energy, it's the madness of it, it's the chaos of it. It's not knowing what's going to happen next, including, for instance, the Captain Sanson of the dam coming on completely naked for the encore and peeing on the audience. I luckily we were at the back and moved out the way, as most people did. But these guys were crazy. Iggy Pop flicking cigarette ends into the crowd. And some of these things were you couldn't do them today. You wouldn't be allowed.
No, you'd wind up with big legal action today.
I probably. But people like Iggy had no fear, and I sort of got off on that. This guy, you don't know what's going to happen next. He just dare do anything, and he did dare do anything. Yeah.
So, Laura, I'm curious. You are a classically trained singer, correct?
Yeah, which feels very strange because, as we've described, I listen to lots of punk and rock and all sorts of genres of music, but not really classical at all. And I guess I got into it by accident. I love music and grew up with lots of music around me. And I guess I, at quite a young age, discovered that I really loved singing. And so I started going to a kind of a Saturday group for kids, like a musical theatre stage school sort of thing, got into musical theatre. And that kind of led me into singing classical stuff and doing all my examinations and things like that. So, yeah, I guess I have that and all the exposure to music to thank for that, really. I think I maybe became a singer because of growing up with all this stuff. I mean, I remember learning all the Beatles harmonies when I was about 6 or 7, just kind of rewinding cassettes and trying to work out what they were doing. And kind of, I had kind of old Wombles records from the 70s, which is kind of a UK novelty group of large fluffy characters singing children's songs.
I have to admit, that's the first time I've ever heard the name, the Wombles.
Oh, please check them out. They're wonderful. But definitely a novelty act. But I absolutely loved them. And I remember, trying to pick out the harmonies that they were doing and picking the tunes out on the piano. And all of this stuff that was being played in the house was definitely seeping into my brain and contributing to me working out the language of music, I guess, which I then later on was able to translate into working my way through getting accomplished at singing.
Do you think that your classically trained voice and your classical training, the two things combined, do you think that gives you any insight into rock and roll at the same time?
Yeah, I think so. And certainly around the time I was kind of really focused on singing as a teenager and doing all my exams and learning lots about the voice, every gig I used to go to, which was quite a few, I'd often go with Dad to see gigs, and the rest of the family, and we'd kind of all go together to all sorts of gigs. And I would be listening to the singer and I'd be thinking, I can hear what you're doing there, and things like that, or how are you doing that? And then I'd go home and try and work out what they were doing. And I've always been fascinated with the human voice and singers, particularly. I want to know what they're doing and why they're doing it and how they're doing it. And still to this day, that's what fascinates me when I'm listening to music. I'm listening to the singer.
Do you think that you would ever want to sing rock and roll?
Well, despite doing the classical stuff in my teens, I've always sung since doing that. However, once I've done my classical training, I kind of haven't really sung too much classically since. I've always been in bands, but very, very varied. I was in a kind of electronica, more experimental kind of band when I was at university, which was a lot of, I would say, classically influenced, but in the context of more electronica and experimental music. I've been in wedding bands, which is required me to sing all sorts of songs, ranging from like to Beyonce, all sorts of things. I've done Motown nights with covers bands, and I'm currently in a more folky band. So there's been, I'll kind of turn my hand to anything really when it comes to singing.
That's really quite talented. I mean, that's amazing that you can just go to almost any genre you choose and master it in some way. Not everybody can do that. Most singers wind up in one specific sort of narrow genre niche. But I think that's admirable that you're able to sort of go in different directions. I'm curious, Peter, want to move into talking about the book and how you developed the book itself. I'm wondering, is your memory just that good, or did you keep journals or diaries from back in the day, or was it just being triggered off of your hanging on to programs and tickets?
It started with the programs and tickets and memories, but then I would look at reports from music papers of the time. I subscribed to something called Rock's Back Pages, which is you pay a subscription and you can get digitized forms of music papers and reviews of artists back in the day. So I can type in The Damned 1977 and it'll bring up some reviews of The Damned or The Clash in 1977. So I would remind myself of that gig. Sometimes I'd find the actual gig, a review, or sometimes a gig on the same tour. So I would use that. And the other thing I would sort of triangulate my memories with reports from the time, but also YouTube videos. So I'd go back and have a look at them and say, oh, yeah, I remember that. So it was partly memory and partly going back. And Laura helped me write it by going back and looking at the literature of the time and the reviews of the time.
So you both did deep research on this, yes?
Yeah. Those research to add to the, I'd basically start with my blog. So we take my blog entry, but then would rewrite it so it was better written and the spelling was correct and simple things like that and the grammar. And then we'd go back to reviews of the time through Rock Back Pages. Laura would help a lot in this. So I'd say to Laura, we should write about The Damned. Have a look at some of our blogs and see if you can find some stuff. So between us, we wrote accounts and improved the accounts that were on my blog. And that's how the book came about.
And so, Laura, you're obviously absorbing stories from your father's youth because you weren't there, clearly. And I'm wondering, did you then have to pick your father's brain even more in order to understand what those stories were?
Yeah, I mean, some of the stories, like what he's already spoken about, seeing Sex Pistols for the first time, are just stories that I've always grown up with. I've big moments that were really made massive impressions on him. I've always known about, he's always chatted about to us growing up. So there was those parts of it, but then there was, these extra details and bands, some of the bands I hadn't heard of that we were looking at that Dad wanted to write about seeing, which has been brilliant for me because not only have I been doing research about the bands and chatting to Dad, a lot of this book needed kind of lengthy phone calls where I'd ring him up and we'd have a chat about his memories, and then I'd match that with some of the things I was finding. Then I'd check with him that this rang true for him and he remembered it. And so there's a lot of going between what we found from the research and trying to jolt Dad's memories to bring those out a bit. But a really fascinating process and introduced me to a lot more music as a result.
Well, let's talk about that process because I think that's what's most interesting to me about the creative act. And that is, who took first stabs at writing each of these pieces? Peter, did you take the first stab at it and then let Laura review it and rewrite it? Or did you dictate things to Laura or tell stories to Laura and then Laura wrote it and you would go back and forth that way? How did it work?
From my viewpoint, I think for most of it, it came from the blog. So I'd already written it on the blog. So I'd say, we need to write a chat about Sex Pistols, Laura. Can you go back and have a look at my blog and try and add to it and try and set in the context of the times? Or I might give another band, The Clash, we need to write about The Clash. And so it started with my blog that I'd already written. So I wrote the initial thing maybe a few years ago, maybe many years ago. And Laura then picked that up and added to it and added other context to it and went and did a bit of research and sent it back to me. And between us, we then agreed it and it went in the book. So that was how I saw the process.
Laura, where did you look for most of your research? Was it online or where else?
Yeah, so as Dad said, first point of call was the blog. And that in itself was quite a process because for these artists, there were often, many, many entries on Dad's blog because he's not just seen them once, he'd seen them many, many times. I mean, David Bowie, there's about 16 entries for, something like that.
Wow.
So it was finding the common threads and the stories that those entries told. And it was using the internet to look at, that period in time. What was 1976 like? What did this mean in the context of 1976 or whatever? So it was a lot of looking on the internet, and then using the resource that Dad spoke of with the digitized music papers and reviews, looking at that. So it was a real range of stuff. And then again, feeding back to Dad with what I'd found, and then trying to tease out extra memories that I'd maybe found, the kind of beginnings of a story within the blog that you hadn't maybe expanded on. Mm-hmm. So there'd be things like saying the stuff that added the color to these stories, and that what made them not just straight up reviews. It was the details of his life, and it was like, the really rainy conditions that he had to drive through to get to the Sex Pistols gigs. On the blog, you might have just said it was really rainy or it was torrential rain. And then that would result in a 20-minute chat with him about what it really felt like to drive through that rain. And my mum really scared that the car was going to float away and things like that. So, it was a real going back and forth, and a real mix between conversation and using the internet.
Well, I think that's excellent in that in reading the book, it could have been very academic, but it isn't. It has a really down-to-earth feel. And in fact, it's written in a very unpunk-like way. There's no snarling in the book. It's not mean-spirited. It's a wonderful review of this period of time and these artists. And so did you ever consider writing any of it with kind of like a rough edge to it?
If I'd say that one, I've never really thought about that. I think I should mention the lady who got us to publish the book. There's a story about her. She's a lovely lady called Teddy Darling. And Teddy was a short-term girlfriend of Sid Vicious.
Oh, is that right?
And I'd previously written an academic textbook on Sex Pistols for someone who wanted a book, an academic book on Sex Pistols to teach popular music to college students in the USA. So I wrote that for him. And through that, somehow, I can't remember how, I got in touch with this lady called Teddy. And Teddy now owns her own publishing house. And she publishes some art. I mean, she's got artists like Susie Quattro as writing for her on her.
And in fact, Susie Quattro has been on StoryBeat.
Ah, right. Well, there you go. Well, she encourages us. And she sort of steered me towards trying to write the book about an academic getting drawn into punk. I hadn't seen it that way at all. And she also wanted to make more of my accident and looking back on my life and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So she steered the book a certain way, which at first I wasn't so sure about. But I think she was right. And I think it's made the book more interesting. But no, I never really thought about making it really snarling and
it could be, but it's very enjoyable to read. It's not a difficult book to read at all. It's not academic and filled with unusual terms, so that's what makes the book fun to read, is that you're reading history, but at the same time it feels like you're living that history. And Laura, you say your contribution in a large way was to add color to what Peter's original blog stories were. Is that right?
That's right. I think it was looking through the blog and seeing where the threads of the stories were and how we could knit all that together in telling this, fascinating time of both Dad's life and of history, really, musical history. And coming back to your point about the book being very, nice and not at all, mean-spirited, that definitely wouldn't be something that I could imagine my dad ever doing. His ethos in many things, including the way he deals with his students and academics, was always see the best in people, always, say kind things. I couldn't imagine him wanting to go down that route, or even being able to do it, really. I don't, most of the gigs that he went to see were gigs that he loved. So I just don't think there would have been any grounds for him to come up with anything that was kind of a bit punk in nature.
So I'm going to stick with Laura on this next question. Obviously, Peter, your dad, saw many superstars perform live that you didn't get a chance to see way back when. You didn't see Mott the Hoople, you didn't see Lou Reed, You would not have seen Led Zeppelin back then, and so on. But I'm curious, do you have a thought in your head as to what makes a great artist in any genre? What makes a great artist great? Is it performance? Is it songwriting? Is it something else? Do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many aspects. And of course, all the things that you've mentioned are really important. You know, the songs, their performance, their talent. But I think what really, for me, defines a great artist is their ability to create this connection with the people who are listening to them, whether in a live context or in a recorded setting. It's almost like a spiritual thing, I think. It's a message that they send out and that a listener receives and internalizes in their own way, and that listener has a response to. It's some sort of deep connection that just makes you go, whoa. And you don't really know why you're going, whoa. It's not, whoa, what a great lyric. It might be that, but usually it's this extra little special something that they've created and sent out.
That's a really wonderful answer. Peter, I'm going to turn it to you as well. What do you think makes great artists great?
Well, I would agree with Laura. I think it's a relationship between the artist and the audience, and ones who connect with the audience. I think it's also authenticity. I love artists who are authentic and come over as their real selves. And I would go to Patti Smith. I would go to Bruce Springsteen. Has been very authentic, and you go to Patti, it's like she's talking to you, and sometimes she literally is. I remember once, very embarrassing, obviously, I'm in the front row watching Patti Smith, and I got up to go to loo, and when I come back to sit down, Patti said something like, "Do you have a good pee?" and embarrassed me in front of the whole crowd, but I took it okay.
Did she get a laugh?
Yeah, of course she did. At my expense, But that's Patti, and so yeah, I think authenticity, but I think there's so many reasons. It has to do with the crowd, the venue, the people you're with, the friends you go with. So many things add to the performance, and we've been having a debate. One thing I haven't mentioned is I've registered for a PhD in popular music by published work with the University of Sunderland. So I'm doing a second PhD now in popular music, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of that. My research question is, what makes a great rock performance?
Well, there you go.
And there we go. And the answer is multifaceted. And also, we've been having a debate with my supervisors. When does the experience begin? Is it when you hear about the concert? Is it when you buy the ticket? When does it end? With the memory still there? It never ends. So, that experience is not just the performance, I would argue. It comes from, in the 70s, queuing outside Newcastle City Hall for 28 hours to get tickets to see the Stones, queuing for a day to get tickets to see Bob Dylan and Earl's Court in 1978. And that was all part of the experience. Of course, you don't do that now. You sit on Ticketmaster at 9 a.m. and try and get in quick to get the tickets, which I'm doing tomorrow for Susie, who's just having a show locally.
Susie Quattro?
No, Susie out of Susie and the Banshees.
Susie and the Banshees.
Yeah.
So I think that what you're talking about is very interesting, about it being from where does it begin to where does it end, which is really endless if you have memory. And so then the question is, and this is probably an unanswerable question, but what is it that makes it then stick? Because we see lots of things in our lives. We will go to lots of concerts or movies or watch TV or whatever it is we're doing, and things frequently don't stick. You don't remember them after a while. You may have a vague memory, but not really a real memory. But you're talking about something that's stuck with you for a long time.
I think it's momentous concerts. Been, as I said, first time I saw the Sex Pistols. It's been one. I went to Live Aid in Wembley Stadium, and one memory which I get emotional even now, and I think and talk about it, is walking out of Wembley Stadium singing "Feed the World," with having just sung it with Bob Geldof and everybody, and we're all walking out, 100,000 people singing "Feed the World," and you never forget that, and you had to be there to believe it, And then it might be fun things like I once went to see Queen on the Bohemian Rhapsody tour, the Night at the Opera tour, and they're really massive. And I didn't have a ticket. I went to buy a ticket. I couldn't get one outside. And then this guy said, "There's a window up the back, and I've found a ladder." And he said, "Anybody coming up with us?" I said, "I'll come up." So anyway, he put the ladder up against the window that was open, and he went up, and I followed him up, and we emerged in the ladies' toilet. I had to stand in the wash basin and get out. Luckily, there was nobody in it. And then we sneaked out of the toilet. Queen just came on stage, and we stood at the back hoping nobody would ask for our tickets, which they didn't. And we saw Queen free, and it was great. And my two friends with me didn't have the bottle to do it, and I'd driven them through. So they went outside, and I came out, and I said, "What it was like?" I said, "It was great. You should have come up the ladder." But anyway, so that sticks in my mind because it was a daring, fun thing to do. You know?
Well, yeah.
So it's various things. And one final one, I went to see something called the March of the Mods tour, which a band called Secret Affair, who were like new mod at the time. And the mods were downstairs singing, "We are the mods, we are the mods," as if in the film Quadrophenia. And upstairs, there was punks and skinheads saying, "We hate the mods, we hate the mods." And then they started throwing tables from the balcony down on the dance floor. Tables. And then the bouncers, the stewards came in with Alsatian dogs to stop the fights.
Wow.
And so that sticks in my mind for other reasons. So, it's big concerts, seeing the Creamery Reform at the Albert Hall. I took Laura and brother David and Marie to see Led Zeppelin at the O2 Arena reunion concerts, where so many million people applied for tickets, and we managed to get tickets through eBay actually. So it's big events and just crazy things that stick in my mind.
Indeed. I'm going to bet Laura has never snuck into a concert through the ladies' loo.
No, I don't think I've actually ever snuck into a concert full stop, which maybe I should try it.
So let's talk about the structure of the book. Did you decide on a structure early on? Did you outline what you were going to do? Or how did you decide how to piece the book together? Laura, how did that come together?
Yeah, so I think Dad initially had some rough ideas of kind of chapters that he definitely wanted to include, and he kind of got that together in a list and sent that across. And then once we kind of, working with Teddy, got kind of a more of a theme that was going to run throughout the book, we, different things emerged as being important, which we then collected into a chapter. So it was very much just identifying. It begins chronologically. The book begins with before punk. It's kind of the story of how that emerges, or rather Dad's experience of it emerging. And then we go through his early punk experiences. So there's this chronologic aspect to it, but there's also themes that kind of gathered together within that as well.
And Peter, how many drafts do you think you went through on the book before it was ready to be sent off to Teddy to take a look at, or her folks?
Oh, I don't know. I wouldn't say drafts. It was iterative. It wasn't like we do draft 1, we do draft 2. It was iterative, so we were working on it until we were happy, really.
Mm-hmm.
And as Laura says, we kept it chronological. I sent a proposal off to Teddy and said, "Are you happy with this?" And then she said, "Well, I would like this particular angle on it, as I've discussed." So we did that. But yeah, we kept it chronological with punk, and then things that grew out of punk, like new ska, new mod, then new romantics, and then bands like Duran Duran and Elvis Costello, new wave. And then I think we did a chapter on American new wave as well.
Mm-hmm.
On Patti Smith television, the Ramones, people that I saw who came over from the States, Iggy Pop, obviously. And so it was chronological, but different themes, because punk is many faceted. And I guess punk, I think, is more, and maybe an English word, whereas American was at the time seemed to be calling more new wave.
New wave versus punk.
Yeah, I think so.
It's interesting. You typically know one person who is the arbiter of that decides we're going to call this thing rock and roll. We're going to call, I think it was Alan Freed who originally called it rock and roll, but there's not like a place you can go to have the name established and then managed. It just sort of goes out into the zeitgeist, right?
Yeah. And I mean, it's managed by the people and to some extent by the music critics and the press. I think they have a lot to do with it, Like the reason I went to see Springsteen was I read the famous report that said, I've seen the future of rock and roll, his name is Bruce Springsteen.
Mm-hmm.
And which took me down to London to see his first concert in 1975 in London, and I paid £10 for a £1 ticket outside of Hammersmith Odeon.
That's amazing. Was that a lot of money then, or was that a little amount of money then?
It was a lot of money, actually, probably. It was probably like paying £200 for a £20 ticket now.
Wow. Okay. So it was expensive. Yeah,
it was, but it was worth it. And I saw Springsteen's first UK appearance, which has gone down in history, and he was that's another one that changed my mind on things. How this guy, as I say, was authentic and played for a long time with a great band with him, the E Street Band.
The E Street Band, sure.
And this is at the time of Born to Run. He just released the Born to Run album, and I bought the album, and it's, I couldn't believe some of the songs, Back Streets and Thunder Road and stuff like that. Fantastic. And he's a storyteller as well.
He's one of the great storytellers.
Yeah, I agree.
He follows in the tradition of Dylan and Pete Seeger and folks like that, and Woody Guthrie. They told great stories through the songs.
I saw Pete Seeger. He was fantastic.
I'm no doubt he was. I've never seen him live, but he truly was one of the greats, and there's no doubt about it. Laura, I want to talk to you about teaching for a moment. What is it about teaching that you enjoy?
Oh, I think it's making relationships with children, which is one of my great loves in life. I really love connecting with children, and I actually think there's a massive performance aspect to teaching.
Sure is.
I think that the creative process of how you're going to get this information in a way that's going to be not just accessible to the children, but actually meaningful and enjoyable, that's a really brilliant challenge for me. And the getting up and delivering the lessons is really brilliant. It definitely speaks to the performer in me, for sure. And and that old storytelling thread is definitely woven through that as well. It's all about telling stories, literally and metaphorically, teaching. It's you're a big part of these children's story, and you are basically delivering a selection of stories that they will hopefully take on board in one way or another and be useful to them. So I think it's all of that, really.
Do you think that by writing the book and other things that you write, do you feel like you're teaching through your writing?
Yeah. I've never really thought about it like that, but I think there's definitely an aspect of that. I'm certainly putting something out into the world that I hope people get something out of, which, is a form of teaching, I guess.
Indeed. And Peter, obviously, you've been a longtime teacher. You're an emeritus professor.
Yeah.
I'm curious, same sort of question for you. What is it about teaching that you really enjoy?
I guess I was a similar sort of answer. It's putting stuff over to students, trying to change their mindset, trying to give them something of yourself, and also as Laura says, there is a performance aspect. I'm quite a shy, introverted person, although over the years less so. I think I brought myself out of it, but getting up to teach 100 odd students when I was 21. Was quite daunting, and I had to almost put on a different face. I became a different person once I walked in that classroom, and I was performing for those students, and I would throw little jokes in, and I'd tell them about the bands I'd been to see as well, and talk about and say, hey, guess who I went to see last night, and I'd have a bit of conversation with them. about that as well. So yeah, I'd like to have a bit interaction with the students.
So I've been teaching for a little more than 12 years. And so it is, at first, it's really daunting to get up in front of a group of people like that. And then after a while, you kind of get used to it, don't you?
Yeah. I mean, I was frightened. What ask me questions I cannot answer. And then in the end, I thought, well, it doesn't matter. I'll just say, well, I'll go away and find out the answer to that, or I'll have to think about that and come back to you later. And so I wasn't worried about that. So that I was often teaching stuff where I didn't really know it that well myself. And I was like one chapter ahead of the students in the textbook and having to do stuff like that. I remember once, the day before a presentation in London, someone said, "Hey, can you go and make this presentation for me, Peter?" So I said, yeah. And I was on the train at 6 o'clock in the morning to get me London at 9 o'clock, reading over their slides on something I knew hardly anything about. Then I had to stand up in front of an audience at a conference, 100 people, and present these slides. And I think what ran through my mind there was, well, what goes wrong? I thought, well, so what? I don't know these people, and I might never see them again, and I won't die. So, it's not the end of the world.
I would be remiss if I did not ask you, Peter. You're one of the world's great contributors to artificial intelligence, which is all over the news right now. And I think what is going to be the coming future big time is going to be artificial intelligence, far more than we even see today. Yeah. I am curious, tell us about artificial intelligence and where you think it's going in the next, let's say, 10 to 20 years.
I think it's going to become I think it's already become part of everyday life. Laura and I both use a lot of day-to-day tools like Alexa and Siri to help us in our day-to-day lives. I think it's going to be part of everything we do. I think there's a danger in it. I think, and Laura and I have written quite a bit about that, and we continue to do so, in that there's a lot of artificial intelligence tools which are developed without the thought of the potential impact of them. So I think there's a lot of stuff that isn't done ethically, that they don't think about what this is really going to do and what the impact might be. They just develop it because it's a clever tool without thinking about the impact. And as disabled individuals, both Laura and I have written quite a bit about AI and disability, and how even tools for disabled people don't always take account of all the needs of disability. So I think we need to guard against artificial intelligence, and we need to make sure at the design stage we involve the user community as much as possible, so that we end up with tools which really are useful and aren't dangerous. But I think they're there in everything we do now, and they're going to become more and more so. But I think we need to guide it carefully.
Laura, what kind of artificial intelligence do you use daily?
So it's things like kind of screen readers and voice activation software, some apps on my phone which are like designed to help blind people identify objects or colors or things like that. Some really ridiculous stories of me trying to independently make a meal, and which I can do very successfully on many occasions, but on some occasions I've used this app and it's actually got me into trouble, and I'm serving up a beautiful meal of, I don't know, just a tin of beans instead of a tin of soup or something like that. It can be very frustrating actually engaging with a lot of the AI tools, but also, there are occasions where I couldn't get by without it. So it's a double-edged sword, really.
It's made life a little easier for you.
Certainly in terms of accessing technology and the written word, for sure. And I couldn't do, all of the writing that I've done with Dad. I couldn't do it without these tools. So, or even as simple as logging on to connect with you today, I've needed my telephone to screen read to me in order to get here. So yeah, it's absolutely invaluable in one respect, but also frustrating in others.
Well, believe me when I tell you that it doesn't matter who you are. There are lots of frustrations with technology. I'm frustrated every day by some form of technology in one way, shape, or form. Peter, I'm wondering, you were talking a moment ago about the potential dangers of AI, and I'm wondering what you think those dangers are. Is one of the dangers that AI could someday actually become sentient?
Well, we're writing a paper with some people in Hong Kong about this at the moment. I think there is a danger that it could, and it could take on a life of its own. And I think we need to guard against that. And
Something like out of the Terminator.
Yeah, and there's already been examples of robots hurting people because they'd misconstrued what this person was doing. So we've got to be careful about what we're developing. We don't want to develop something that's going to take over our lives. So I think there is a danger of that. So we're busy writing about that at the moment, and I've been trying to write a piece with Laura and some others about, has AI got a soul, and can it ever have a soul, and should it have a soul?
Well, what do you think? Do you think that AI could have a soul someday?
Well, it depends on the definition of soul. I think it depends on what we build into it. I think it's never going to be the same as a human, obviously, whatever happens. But I think it can become very close and very dangerous as a result. And I think we need to guard against that.
I think the only definition of soul that it should have is that it likes Aretha Franklin.
I never saw Aretha Franklin.
Well, I have been having an incredibly wonderful chat today with Professor Peter Smith and Laura Smith. And I'm wondering, for each of you, in all of your experience, can you relate to us or provide us with a story that's either weird, strange, offbeat, quirky, or just plain funny from your experiences?
I went to see Paul McCartney and Wings in the 70s. And this shows how your memory can play tricks. And I remember we went again. I used to often go without ticket, and I always got in somehow. And I went, and I had no ticket to see Paul McCartney, 1972 or 3. And my recollection is that I bribed the bouncer, the steward, and gave him £1 or something at the time to let me in. And he took me to the door with his hand on my shoulder, and in I walked, and I got in. But my friend who was with me, he says, no, that's not what happened. He says, we were outside with a load of girls from America, and the bouncer and the steward came to the door, and he said, Paul says, let 20 people in. And he let us and the girls from America in, and because Paul McCartney had told him to do so. Now, which is true, who knows? But it just shows you how something that was implanted in both our minds, we remember differently. And I don't know, he swears down he's right, but I thought I was right. So that's not so much a funny story, but a strange one, in that we both have quite different recollections.
That is amazing when two people remember the exact same incident totally differently.
Yeah, but the talking about was, we did get in, we did see the show, it was great, but how we got in, who knows?
Laura, do you have a story you could share with us?
Oh, well, I guess it's there's several that go through my head, but I think one that just felt quite magical at the time was my dad and I were going to see Nick Cave and in Edinburgh, and it was my first time seeing Nick Cave. I believe Dad had already seen him probably several times before, and my dad and I had listened to quite a lot of Nick Cave stuff over the years. And Dad particularly had always really, really loved this one quite niche track called Breathless. I'm not sure which album it was off, but anyway, we looked up online, and Nick Cave had never, ever played Breathless live. And Dad was like, oh, I wish he would play that. He never will, though. Anyway, we can see where this story's heading, but we arrive at the concert, have a lovely time. Nick Cave goes off stage, comes back on, does some encores. Off he goes. Dad says, oh, that's it. I've looked at set lists from the other gigs, and that's it. He doesn't do any more encores. So we're kind of getting our bags ready to shove our way through the crowd and, get back to the car. When here he comes back again, and he's like, oh, I'm going to do a song that I've never really done before. It's called Breathless. And here he goes, launches into this very song that particularly Dad had been hoping for. And that was a very lovely moment.
Well, that is a wonderful moment. All right,
Can
so
I give you one more?
oh, sure.
Yeah, and Laura was there as well. I took Laura to see Eminem in Glasgow.
Wow.
Oh no.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. Yeah, it was quite a wild concert, and a lot of the crowd were either high or drunk or both, and there was a lot of fights in the crowd. Anyway, being disabled, Laura being blind, we were in the disabled car park, which was inside the venue. So when we drove out, we were driving through the crowds, and this guy, well, first a girl jumped in and said, "What's the time?" And she said, "I've lost my boyfriend." And then she says, "Oh, he's there." And she jumped back out the car. Laura's in the back. I'm driving the front of the doors unlocked foolishly. Then this guy jumped in. He says, "Take me home." I says, "No, I'm not taking you home." He says, "You're effing going to take me home." And I says, "No." And anyway, I tried to push him out the car. He wouldn't get out. Laura said, don't hurt me, Dad." And he says, "I'm going to effing kill you. I'm going to kick you in the head." And he proceeded to try and kick me in the head. He got me in the shoulder. And then his friends pulled him out of the car. I locked the doors. And he started kicking the windows on the side of the car. And I drove home from Glasgow. So it's a couple hundred miles, probably, not quite that. And quite terrified. And the next morning I had black and blue shoulder, which went very yellow. And the car had footprints all around the side, but the window didn't break. And there was no real damage to the car. So that was quite a different experience. Go to see. So beware Eminem in Glasgow. And if you do, keep your doors locked.
Well, I never thought of Eminem as having punk roots, but that's what it sounds like.
I think it very much does.
All right, so last question for each of you today, and we'll start with Laura. I'm just wondering if you have a solid piece of advice or a tip that you might be able to share with those folks that are just starting out trying to figure out how to be writer or a teacher or any of your skill sets. Do you have a piece of advice or a tip for them?
Yeah, I guess what I'd say is either when writing or teaching or anything that you want to do in life, it comes back to what makes a great performer. It's the ability to connect. And I think the route to connection is through authenticity, as my dad pointed out before. So I would say, don't try and second guess the audience or the reader or the people in front of you that you're teaching. Don't try and think about what they're expecting from you and try to be it. Just try to think what makes you and your story or your message special, and just really try to emit that in the best way you possibly can that is true to you.
That is really fabulous advice. I just think that's terrific because, yes, you've got to be true to you in order to have a voice to express that people can actually observe and absorb. Peter, I'm wondering if you have a solid piece of advice or a tip you can share with us.
And similar things. I think it's about storytelling, but I think it's about giving something of yourself and opening yourself up to the class and being vulnerable and showing, telling them stories about your personal life, about the bands you've been to see, etc. And so making yourself more human. So you're not this lecturer who stands up and spouts stuff at them. You're a human person who interacts with them and finds out what they're interested in and has a bit of chat. I once had I know a lady who believes in what she calls the caring teacher, and she says teaching is more about building a relationship with the class and the student than delivering the content. And she would do things like go into class and say, "Do you like brass band music?" And they'd say, "Yeah." She said, "Right, we're going to listen to brass band music for 10 minutes. And she'd play brass band music to the class for 10 minutes. And they thought she was crazy. But that was her way of breaking the ice and of sharing something of herself before she went on and delivered the content. So I think there's something in that, about, bearing your soul to the class almost, and being honest and authentic and telling stories and building a rapport with the class, so that they understand you as a person as much as the content you're delivering.
I think that's also very, very wise advice. That you aren't a robot, you're not AI, and you should really relate to your class as a person as well. Though you're in charge of the class and you have theoretically more knowledge than the class, but you need to relate to them as a human.
Yeah, I agree.
So this has been just a wonderful hour plus on StoryBeat today, and I'm delighted that Professor Peter Smith and Laura Smith have joined me today, and I can't thank you both enough for your time, your wisdom, and for all of your great stories.
I really enjoyed it, Steve, and thanks for the opportunity. I suppose being a storyteller, I like talking about myself as well, and I've enjoyed having a chat with you. And with Laura there as well. It's been great to have this opportunity to chat with you. I hope the people listening enjoyed it as well.
Thanks so much for having us. It really has been really fun.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.